18 December 1972. What does real horror sound like when the sky itself is on fire and the man bleeding beside you keeps whispering that he can smell his own burning flesh? On that cold Hanoi night, during the opening hours of Operation Linebacker II, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber pushed into the most heavily defended airspace ever faced by American crews, where Soviet-built SA-2 surface-to-air missiles clawed upward like glowing spears, and the darkness was stitched with anti-aircraft fire so thick it felt solid. And as the bomber formation thundered forward, one aircraft took a brutal hit that ruptured systems, injured crewmen, and filled the cabin with smoke and panic, yet its pilot refused the order to turn back, knowing that a gap in formation would expose every aircraft behind him to radar lock and missile fire. And while alarms screamed and the aircraft shook, as if being torn apart, the bomber held its line, absorbing the attention of enemy defenses long enough for the rest of the strike package to reach their targets and escape. A decision that saved dozens of lives in the air, but sealed the fate of those inside when another missile detonated close enough to cripple the aircraft beyond recovery, forcing the crew to bail out over hostile territory. And that is where the war descended into its most intimate and horrifying form, because hours later, after the thunder of bombers faded and the jungle swallowed the parachutes, a small rescue element moved in under cover of darkness, including a combat medic who knew before stepping off the helicopter that survival would depend less on skill and more on luck. As enemy patrols hunted the downed airmen and flares turned the night into a flickering nightmare of shadows and screams. And when contact erupted without warning, the medic crawled through wet leaves and shattered branches while bullets snapped overhead, finding the first wounded crewman with shrapnel embedded in his abdomen, the smell of blood metallic and thick. And as he worked by touch alone, hands slick and shaking, the medic heard the unmistakable thump of mortars landing close enough to spray dirt into open wounds, forcing him to shield the injured man with his own body while whispering lies about how help was close, because hope was sometimes the only anesthesia available. And when another airman was dragged in, legs mangled from a bad landing, bone visible, the medic had to make choices that still haunt war survivors decades later. Tightening tourniquets until flesh went pale and cold, injecting morphine while knowing it might slow breathing, and all the while the jungle echoed with distant shouting that crept closer minute by minute, turning every snapped twig into a promise of death. And yet the medic stayed, because leaving meant certain execution for the wounded. And as the firefight intensified, the radio crackled with broken transmissions about incoming helicopters being waved off due to heavy fire, meaning extraction was delayed, maybe indefinitely, and that delay birthed pure horror, because one wounded airman began screaming as shock set in, screaming so loudly the medic had to press his hand over the man's mouth, not to silence fear, but to keep them all alive, feeling the vibration of screams against his palm, and wondering if this was the moment they would be found. And when enemy fire finally tore through the brush, the medic fired back blindly while dragging a wounded man by his webbing, slipping in blood and mud, aware that if captured, the rules of war would evaporate, because Linebacker II was not a gentle campaign and prisoners disappeared into years of suffering. And just before dawn, when exhaustion hollowed out fear into something dull and heavy, the sound of rotor blades returned, low and fast, a desperate gamble by pilots who flew into missile envelopes to pull their people out. And as the medic loaded the wounded under fire, one helicopter took hits and still hovered, refusing to lift until everyone was aboard, mirroring the same refusal shown hours earlier by the bomber pilot who would not turn back, a chain of defiance stretching from the sky to the mud. And when the helicopter finally clawed upward, leaving behind empty stretchers stained dark, the medic looked down at his hands and realized he could no longer tell where the blood ended and his skin began. And days later, when reports confirmed that the bomber's choice to stay in formation had prevented catastrophic losses across the squadron, there were no parades, no speeches in that jungle clearing, just silence, nightmares, and the knowledge that survival came at a cost measured in screams, scars, and decisions made in seconds that echo for a lifetime. And as you hear this story now, knowing the bomber held the line, the medic held the wounded, and death circled them both, ask yourself this: if you were there smelling smoke, hearing men beg not to be left behind, and knowing one step back might save you but doom everyone else, would you have stayed, or would fear have won?